Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today on the letters of recommendation. As a college counselor, I can say that I am deep within this season, and everyone in our office is trying to find time to write letters to advocate for our students. And so we are so excited for the timeliness of this topic and eager to hear from our panelists. To tell you a little bit about the format of today, we have three panelists joining us from this side of the desk to talk about the letter of recommendation process. And at the bottom of your webinar screen, you'll see the opportunity to ask a question via the Q&A function. So if you have a question while somebody is chatting, you can go ahead and type that question in, and we'll either integrate that into the conversation or save that for the Q&A portion at the end. So we look forward to answering your questions in real time and engaging in a dialogue on letters of recommendation. Let's begin by introducing our panelists.
Hey there, I'm Tyler, counseling at Holy Innocents Episcopal School. That's here in Atlanta. I have been here for 5 years. This is the start of my sixth. Before this, I spent just over 3 years working in the undergraduate admissions office at Emory University, also here in Atlanta.
Hey, Kim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Kim Jackson Allen, and I'm a professional school counselor in Savannah, Georgia, Savannah-Chatham County Public School Systems. And I've been working as a professional school counselor since 1999 and had a small stint through a small learning communities grant as a college and career coach. And I'm happy to be here today.
Hi, I'm Steve Soud. I'm at the Bolles School in Jacksonville, Florida. And let's just say I have over 20 years of experience. We'll stop there. Mostly on the high school side, but also on the college side at Davidson College in North Carolina.
Excellent. Well, Tyler, Kim, and Steve, we're so excited to have your expertise today. And we'll begin by chatting with Tyler. You mentioned that you have worked on both sides of the desk. Tell us a little bit about your perspective from reading counselor letters to now writing counselor letters.
Sure. Yeah. For me, I think all of what I do now in starting to draft a letter and in how I actually write has a lot to do with my experience reading. And so much of what happens in my mind is geared at writing a letter that I think would be helpful for the person that's ultimately reviewing the file, and my experience doing that. And so the flashbacks that I have is I think a lot of people who have worked on the college side can sympathize with are reading files in a relatively quick manner. And so for me, making sure that I'm clear and concise in my letters and that you're getting something across that's really core to the student and that's important to the review, and trying to avoid things that really go beyond that. And so I find that for myself, there's this balance between sort of the material that the college needs and wants to hear, and then the material that I might want to present. I'm really fortunate to work with good kids, and I think like many of us, I get pretty fired up about advocating for my students. And so there are times when I think I need to sort of scale back, and I'll find myself reading a letter saying, okay, if I were moving through this in part of a 10 to 12 or maybe 14-minute file review, would I really want to open up the PDF file on my screen that says it's 3 pages long, and now I'm expected to sort of dig into that? The last thing that I want when someone opens up to read a letter is the groan of like, this is my 35th file of the day, man, and you've written like a 3-page letter that I'm going to have to dive into. So yeah, that really sort of shapes how I present the tone and what's included in the letter, and then being sure that what I'm getting at is really meaningful to what, for at least in my experience, is sort of a selective college admission review. And there are a couple, I think, of really sort of critical things that we can talk about in terms of content, but that's a lot of what guides me. What would you do if you're reading quickly in an application, and particularly if you're reading a counselor rec that oftentimes is being looked at after you've already seen a student's activity history and academic transcript?
So would you say, Tyler, that you have sort of like an archetype that you follow, knowing what you want to avoid, but also then knowing the things you want to always include in a letter or a structure?
Sure. Yeah, I think most of the time that I do. And the way that it falls for me, and I sort of have a template that I worked through in my mind of getting, in the first sort of moments of the letter, a paragraph of just sort of what's at the student's sort of essence to who they are. And not that this is what I'm expecting out of readers, but with a mentality of if someone read no further than my first paragraph, would they have enough information to look at a student and say, okay, I think I have a pretty good grasp of who that is. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that's providing sort of the broad overview of what this student looks like within the context of our school. And so much of, I think, what the counselor letter does is to provide that 30,000-foot view of here's the kid within the entire school community. If teacher recommendations are sort of myopic in how they focus on a student's interaction in a classroom, then I don't need to spend as much time focusing on a student's classroom behavior where I'm not oftentimes the expert, but instead can give some color to what else is in an application, revolving around the student's academic commitments, the choices they've made within a transcript, and the classes they've chosen, any sort of bumps along the road or things that you wouldn't see in just reviewing the transcript alone, and then placing that student beyond the academic piece in the context of their peers. How do they interact with other seniors? How do they interact with teachers? What's their impact on the school here? So if I were to sort of to distill that down to a couple of sections, to me it feels like in a one-page letter, a heading sort of paragraph of the altogether summary of here's who this kid is, followed by a paragraph and maybe a little bit more than that about the academic credentials of the student, but getting beyond just number of AP classes they've taken, and highlighting the things that are unique to that particular kid. So oftentimes those are the choices they've made in the classes that they've taken, or sometimes it's the choices that they were constrained by. And so if they took that additional language class as a sophomore, it meant that there was some opportunity cost that they passed on. And so within our school, being the expert to say, what you're seeing on this transcript is shaped by the student's own preferences and choices, but also some other things that are acting on that. And then moving from that sort of broad overview of academics, any specifics or nuance, to a place of the student within our community. And sometimes that's built around extracurriculars. Other times it's built around students' impact and interactions with their classmates in a way that's not necessarily represented by an activity list or a resume. And then other times that's pulling in things from the student's family life, from the student's personal life, that add to what's in the application that might not otherwise be seen. So a student who has fended for themselves within a difficult family situation, or supporting a sibling, or things that are sort of more simple than that. The student that missed 2 weeks at the start of junior year due to a concussion and had to really sort of to battle to get back in a couple of their more challenging classes. Yeah. And then ending with, for me, a fourth section that kind of pulls that together, but with an eye towards what might be next for that student. And I wouldn't make it as simple as, I think this kid will major in business with a minor in, but instead thinking about within your particular college environment, this is the type of student that you might see. If it's a really engaging kid, I might say something along the lines of like, this student would remind me of a really good tour guide, or someone that you would want to get out in front of prospective families because of the way that they could be an ambassador. Trying to paint some picture of what that student would be like once they get to that campus.
It sounds like some of the big themes of that to take away are that context is so important. So providing the context of the student in your school and the context of how that student could fit into the community, to the college to which, he or she is applying. But here's a question for you, Tyler. How honest can you be in that letter?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think you have to be honest in a way that you feel like you're supporting your student, but that gives an accurate picture of what's happening. So much of the work that we do from high school side to college side is built around an expectation of trust. And so if I'm writing for students in a way that is overly inflating kids, or that's glossing over things that are actually a serious issue, then I think I've done a disservice to the trust that exists between me and my colleagues on the other side of the desk. Now, there are some ways that you can be sort of careful, I think, about doing that. So for me, if there's a really sensitive or sticky situation, that's a really good time to pick up the phone and to call someone. I know that counselors and some schools in particular are reluctant to put certain things in writing, and that is totally understandable and your prerogative if you'd rather have a phone call about a student. But I think you have to be honest in a way that gives credibility to what you're seeing in a file. And again, sort of drawing on the experience that I've had reading, there's an immediate lack of credibility if you're reading a file where the counselor rec is just incredibly enthusiastic and there's all this positive there, but there's other things that you've seen in the file that aren't being addressed. And it looks like a counselor might be sort of going overboard to prop up a student while ignoring some of those weaknesses. I think that potentially poses a problem. And then what I also think about is, especially when reading groups of applications, if you're reading by school or if you're at a place where you're going to see multiple applications from a particular counselor, you're taking away your own credibility if you go as far as to just write a really, really beautiful rec that's overly positive for every single kid. Because the reality is there's variation within those students where you might not be overly enthusiastic about every single one. And so if you've sent 20 applications to a particular school and your rec is as flowery and exuberant for each and every student, then you've missed an opportunity to try and sort of to note the actual variations within that group. And at the end of the day, what I remind myself is that a letter is not ultimately where the decision hinges. I think I sometimes sort of feel this pressure that like, okay, well, what I write is going to be really important, and if I can just go to bat enough for this kid, then I can get them in, which is just never the case. There's no beautiful amount of writing in a counselor rec, that, at least that I can think of in my experience, that overcame other reservations we had about a student. And in fact, I think it was more likely to go the other way, where if you have some reservations and you're not seeing it addressed by a counselor, then you start to wonder if what you're getting is actually an authentic idea of who that student is.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think, and tell me if this is true for you, you've got the kids at the beginning of the year you're so excited to write for. You can already picture the structure of the letter in your head and you're ready to go. But then you get to the student who just kind of goes through the motions, isn't, the star athlete or in all the school plays or at the top of their class or happens to speak 5 languages or has a really interesting family history. How do you write an honest letter that advocates for a relatively average student?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're not Lake Wobegon. They're all different types of kids.
Yeah.
And so getting into how you support kids of either sort of late growth in high school or a student that's really struggled. For me, you can find ways to call attention to what the strengths are within an application. And sometimes it might not be the academic piece. I can think of students that I've written for where you're acknowledging that there are some real rough spots in the student's transcript, but can still point out where maybe a student found some growth in connecting to a particular teacher, in relating to a particular project or something that happened in class. I can think sometimes of students that might struggle in the classroom space in opening up for discussion or for conversation, and that potentially impacts a grade. I think finding ways to support students that there's something else happening there. In all of those cases, I think being honest about the story that's behind either a struggling student or an average student.
Mm-hmm.
And so being able to say, and in prepping for this, I read over some old letters, and I think that I think that Aaron and Dave will talk about this, but I think we can probably put some of those into the SACAC page as examples. But the kids who fly under the radar or just sort of, chugging along, doing their thing, and they don't speak the 5 languages, not captaining 8 of your sports teams, those kids can still be really interesting letters to write based on their character or their personal qualities. And if it's a student that is really under the radar and you don't know them that well, it's a great opportunity to go to a couple of teachers or club advisors or people that they're close to and to say, give me the couple of high points for where you see this kid thriving at school. It might not be in the classroom, it might not be on a sports field, but what are those moments that I can support that while still acknowledging that, there might be some growth for this student that we're still looking to see coming into senior year.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. And Tyler, did you have a letter you wanted to show a part of today, or do we?
Yeah, I can pull some stuff up. Give me 1 sec, and then I'll attempt to go share screen.
Great. And while he's doing that, I'll let you know that some folks have asked about an example for a bulleted letter, and to just preview some of the upcoming conversation, we will definitely be talking about that near the end of the webinar with some examples.
Yeah, and I think, and so this is, Erin, is this showing in a way that you guys can?
This is perfect.
This was a student who was sort of the typical late blooming boy, struggled to find his place a little bit socially, initially was drawn towards sports, and then had this sort of really critical moment where he didn't make a team, and then found other ways to get into that, which said a lot about who he was. It took him some time to find his footing in high school, and so I think throughout here I find ways to sort of point at that. But in terms of form, I think, in getting back to what works for me, at least in terms of format, you could read the first paragraph and get an idea of who the kid is. And if you moved on because everything else looks strong or you're not worried, then there's enough there to support the student. While then sort of building out examples of what I think I've asserted there in the next couple of spaces. So that larger next block is about the student's transcript, and so not getting so much into he took this many classes at non-honors or AP level, but instead saying, here's where he found comfortable, and here are classes that weren't always working for him. Here's how the academic piece came together for this particular student with what was happening in his social world here, and how when those things sort of clicked, that put him in a place where he was able to do a little bit better. And you would see on this transcript that this is a student who was really sort of bouncing around in terms of grades and struggling until the junior year when he started to get there. Didn't have a lot of extracurricular involvement here, and so I point a lot to what he's doing in the community, working as a coach, which also is a nice story, I think, given his bounce back from being cut from a team and instead pouring himself into the coaching piece. And then at the end, trying to put that together in a way that for this particular student, I think paints him onto a campus. And so part of this too is knowing where your students are looking and applying. And so for this case, I knew that this student was looking entirely at sort of small liberal arts type experiences. And so I'm able to call some attention to that at the bottom by pointing to what's already been there before. So this is a kid who does really well in discussion-based classes, who likes to dive in and sort of think about things critically. And because of that, and as sort of an aside, a kid who's still growing and probably needs a little bit of extra support, and some teachers that are looking out for him would be a really nice fit in a smaller type of setting.
This is really great. Thank you for sharing this, Tyler.
Yeah, and I'll be happy. There's a couple of others, and I'd be happy to sort of drop this onto where the webinars live for SACAC so that folks can see those. And if you end up going through these, you'll see, and as I sort of pass it off to other folks, there's no right or wrong way to do this, and I find that my letters sort of vary in whether I try and bullet some things out for, adding either emphasis or things like teacher quotes and things like that. As long as you're getting the kid in the context of your academic environment and social environment without just rehashing the transcript and the student's resume, I think you're doing a lot to support a student. And knowing that this particular type of letter is still, given what I said earlier, probably a little bit long, a little bit denser than it needs to be.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. And if you think of another question that you'd like to ask Tyler, he'll be with us again for the Q&A portion at the end. So thank you for this.
Yeah.
We really appreciate that. Hi, Kim.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good. Well, I'm excited to chat with you about some of your methodology around writing letters of recommendation. Will you tell us a little bit about where you work and what your process looks like for writing letters?
I sure will. Thank you, Erin. I'm a public school counselor in the Savannah-Chatham County School System at AE Beach High School. And our process is probably maybe a little bit different from some of the smaller schools because of the fact that there are only 2 school counselors in our school with close to 1,000 students. So sometimes it makes the process of submitting letters of recommendation somewhat cumbersome in a way because of time constraints and because of other administrative issues that we may have. So my colleague and I attempted to develop a system to help streamline this process. And what we do at the very beginning of the year, usually about 3 weeks into the school year, is we have what is called a senior parent night. And we just basically provide an overview of what the expectations are for senior year. And in doing that, we also include information regarding writing letters of recommendation. And in such, we ask that the students complete what is considered a brag sheet, or basically a student resume to us. And our Jobs for Georgia graduate teacher is a great assistant with helping us to do that, because she is the one who actually proofreads the resumes, and she's also the one who conducts the resume writing workshops. As a matter of fact, she did 3 of them today and will probably do about 2 more later on this week. In addition to that, we make sure that, especially for our senior English classes, that we get our senior English teachers to come in and fill out a sheet based on the work that the students have done in the past if they've been in their classes before. And this is usually for our more advanced classes like our AP and our honors classes. And if possible, which is not always likely, we sometimes try to get the parents to complete a questionnaire. Now this again, in a sense, I don't want to say it can be biased, but sometimes because it is a parent who's providing the perspective of their own child, it may be a little bit slanted in terms of the way they feel about their child. And that's, of course, a natural and innate characteristic of parents. But mainly we use that student resume. And on that resume, we ask those students to include not only the academic piece of them, but also any community service that they have been involved in the community. We also ask them to include any extracurricular organizations, anything athletic, any academic clubs, any type of competitions that they've participated in, so that we can get a general overview of what that student has done in the duration of their time in high school. What we would like for our students to do, and this does not always happen, is we want to make sure, because we're dealing with premillennials here, and we want to make sure that these students are submitting information to us in a timely manner. And there are several reasons why we ask for that. One, because we want to ensure that we're writing a very thorough and accurate letter for that student. 2, if we do not know the student as well as some of our other students, we want to make sure that we usually call those students into our offices and just have an informal, not necessarily even a counseling session, but just an informal session to try to get an overview of the student and get to know some personal characteristics and traits about that student, so that we can have some valid input into that letter. And then 3, because of the other administrative duties that we often have, it can be somewhat challenging if you come to me 2 to 3 days before something is due in an admissions package and ask me to write a letter for you. And as a professional school counselor, I want to ensure that I'm providing a quality product for you, but I want to make sure that that is done in a timely fashion. So another thing that we like asking the students to do, if they know of the colleges and universities that they're interested in, and we know that that school requires a letter of recommendation, we're asking that you at least 2 weeks would be pushing it, but at least 3 weeks to a month in advance, if you could provide that information for us, because usually those more selective schools have not necessarily extended deadlines, but they're going to have those early action deadlines anyway. So we want to make sure that that information is in place. We also don't want it to be a situation where, and let me choose my words carefully, where a school counselor is blamed, and I'm using that in quotes, for not allowing you to participate or to enroll in the school of your choice. So we want to make sure that we have a prudent role and encouraging you to make sure that you start this process early. It's done through communique to students. We send home a senior parent letter. We continue to make announcements over the intercom. So we want to make sure that the student is aware, both in writing and physically, by reminding them in person of what the expectations are for them as seniors in high school.
So Kim, is that brag sheet, is it a digital survey? Is it a piece of paper that they write it on and turn it into you? What is that mechanism?
It can be a combination of both. You can submit it to us electronically through Google Chrome, or you can just do it the old-fashioned way by providing us with a copy. We've had some students email the information to us as well, so we can make sure that we have it on file. And what we do, aside from what is considered their permanent record, is we keep an actual file on each student. So if that student is assigned to our caseload, then we should have that student brag sheet on that student.
What is your sort of process for tracking down a student that you know has one of these requirements for a counselor letter, but maybe misses your 3-week to a month window? What do you do then?
We do just what you said. We track them down. One of the things that we do again is we continue to have senior parent meetings and also individual senior meetings with those students to remind them of deadlines. And then we also use our mechanism, because we know that they are attached to technology. We use a format called Remind 101, where we have all of our students, and this is by each grade level. If there is pertinent information that needs to be sent to those students, then for our seniors, that would be considered our level 4 group, because they're in their 4th year of high school. We would send a remind text to them, to remind them of what is due and when it is due. And we send that collectively as a group. And then individually, if we know that these timelines are coming up, then we may individually call that student out of class as a reminder to let them know and to ensure to them that, we, just because the deadline says that it's November 15th, we don't want to always send this on November 15th. We want to make sure that it's done maybe a few weeks before that time.
What would you say is your biggest advice for a counselor who has a really large caseload and has to write a large volume of numbers of those letters?
I would definitely say to start early, and that's a misnomer in a sense, particularly when you have a large caseload. But what I would also encourage you to do is to get your teachers involved as well. And with some information from teachers, for example, if teachers could provide input, we've had teachers in the past, we've gone to teachers and we've actually put it in writing to ask them to give us a descriptor of the student. Like, if, for example, if you could describe the student, what would you say about this student? And so that teacher has an opportunity to provide some robust adjectives for us, because this teacher is the one who is going to be instructing the student in the class. And while we may have our overview as counselors is a little bit broader than theirs, they will be more so able to speak to the student in terms of their intellectual and academic capacity that we may not necessarily be able to do at times, instead of just seeing it in black and white or looking at a transcript.
And Kim, what would you say is the time frame for writing letters for you? How long does it typically, if you have a brag sheet and all that information, how long do you spend on each letter?
I would say it would depend on the person. The individual student that we're working with, and Tyler referenced this earlier, and sometimes you can look at a student, and it's not always academics, sometimes it's students who are involved in a plethora of community service or extracurricular activities that when you see their brag sheet that you're going to have an opportunity to probably write extensively about a student. Sometimes maybe even write too much and have that and you have to have that letter streamlined. And then, of course, there are instances where there may be just an average student, and you may have to ask yourself, exactly where do I start in terms of writing this letter for this student? So I would say basically for an average letter for a student who is academically sound and is involved in a pretty good amount of community service or extracurricular activities, I would say at least a minimum of an hour, maybe an hour and a half. And that's simply because of the fact that your thought process sometimes may shift, and you're trying to think of personal experiences that you may actually have with that student. So I would say, just to bear on the safe side, maybe about an hour and a half.
Yeah, always give yourself more time than you think you need.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Kim. We appreciate your insight, and we'll look forward to having you back for question and answer time at the end.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Hi, Steve.
Hi.
So I want to know, after we've been talking about the use of the letters, the process for writing letters, you have a lot of collective experience on both sides of the desk. Thinking towards the future of letters of recommendations from counselors, what do you see? What trends have you noticed?
Well, let me say broadly, I've been thinking about this the last couple of days. I think over time, letters have moved from, shall we say, the Baroque to more impressionistic. And I think we're probably headed in more impressionistic directions. Keeping that in mind, though, I think it's fair to say that there are certain things that really have not changed in quality letter writing over the years. The soul of a good letter of recommendation has always been anecdotes and comparisons. Those are about providing context and providing life and energy to a student. And sometimes, and I'll give an example, you'll even see how those things have can reflect a particular student. That's important. I think it's also important when we're writing to understand the audience on the other side, not only the speed with which they're reading, and we'll talk about that, but also maybe institutional needs. And, we'll give an example there. But when I say the Baroque to the impressionistic, what I'm talking about is essentially, I think letters have gotten a little bit less flourished, florid, whatever the right word would be there, over time. And we've had some questions about, sort of the future of reading and bullet point letters of recommendation. And those may be a little bit more of where things are headed 5-10 years down the line. And we can talk about some of the whys and some of the wherefores. What I'm going to try to do, bear with me, is I'm going to try to share screen on a couple of letters. And I'm going to start with, and let me say too, before I preface these letters, I'm sort of somewhere in between Baroque with lots of detail and florid language, and Impressionism, which would be more the bullet point approach. But I've over the years aware that there are first readers, particularly at highly selective colleges, who may not be reading as thoroughly as we might hope for. I've been putting in bold and italics key points that I think are significant, that I want to make sure are communicated and are picked up even on a cursory reading of a letter. And so you'll see some examples of this. So I'm going to try to share screen here. I'm going to start with a letter that was almost all anecdote and comparison in certain ways. And I structured it to reflect who the student really was. So I had a young woman I worked with several years ago. We'll call her Amanda. And I'm going to shift over to her letter. Her name's been changed. And she was very interested, as you read the letter, she was very interested in the classics, and she was very interested in archaeology. She ended up actually, when she was in college, going on an archaeological dig sponsored by one of her college professors. And I thought, how am I going to represent this kid? She was really interesting, compelling intellectually, not necessarily top of the class, but a really interesting kid. And as I call her in the letter, sort of a dark horse intellectually. And so what I did was I treated it like as if I were digging down layer by layer in the way that an archaeologist would. So you can see I talked about stratigraphic layer A, the Latin scholar, and provided an anecdote there. As we scroll down a little bit lower, we've got stratigraphic layer B, the organizer of tutors, and that was an anecdote about what she was doing with one of our community service programs. stratigraphic layer C, roadside angel. And I actually picked up this anecdote from one of our faculty members who lived in her neighborhood and just happened to share the story with me over the lunch table or in a meeting or something like that. And I thought, well, that needs to go into the letter. And then stratigraphic layer D, the clever prankster, I actually got to teach this student and was able to tell this story. And this was a little bit tailored towards a college where she was applying, early decision, because I knew that they knew the student who had been a year ahead of Amanda and put all of that in. But that's sort of a fun thing. But again, it is built on the whole idea of anecdotes and comparisons. Let me share a different letter, and this is for a student who was Pell eligible. Again, the name's been changed. And, as we know, a lot of colleges are looking to boost Pell eligible numbers. It is a very, very worthy goal. And, but a reader might not always know, is this student Pell eligible? They might not be reading with the financial aid data available to them for whatever reason. I get that, put that, you can see the first paragraph in bold and italics, a Pell eligible first generation college student. And the student was applying in particular to a program where those things were going to be important. And they would certainly give her a step up in the process. So I want to highlight that for the reader so they can't miss it. The other thing you see down in the second paragraph, and this is something we put in all of our letters, we don't have a lot of grade inflation here at Bolles. And to put that in context, and I have to update this every year. So this year it's up to, we have 20 students in the last 20 years of students who've been here for all 4 years who have made straight A's all the way across their transcript. Wow. So we put that context into a letter to let everyone know, there are schools out there, I'm told by admissions officers, where 75% of the students have over a 4.0. We don't happen to be one of those schools, and we want to communicate that. And again, it goes in italics and bold. So you can see that's sort of heading towards a little bit more of what we would call the bullet point letter, what I've been calling is sort of impressionistic. I'm going to stop sharing that. I'm going to go to another letter now. And this is actually sort of an international student. And had fun with this one. And I called them Victorisms. And I had some quotes of these are funny things he would say in the office. And one day he comes in an all-white outfit. I said, Victor, what's up with that? And he just looked at me deadpan and said, this is to reflect sunlight into the eyes of my enemies.
I love that.
And then, this kid had an extraordinary command of colloquial English. I said, Victor, where did you learn that? And he says, again, deadpan, he was always, it's all those Adam Sandler movies that my dad got me to watch when I was young. And he was a big video gamer too. And when he had to pay $75 to apply somewhere, he's like, that's a whole collector's edition of Battlefield 1. And those little bullet points, those are sort of crosses. They're not so much contextual points as they are mini anecdotes. And you see some of the contextual points down in the second paragraph. He's got the best command of colloquial English of any international student I've ever worked with. And then at age 16, he was the youngest member of our senior class, among other things. And I'll share one more that's headed in the bullet point direction. And this is for a really stellar student who was applying to an Ivy. It was a pretty easy letter to write in the sense that not only was she a legacy at that particular school, but she was also a recruited athlete. And you can see that second paragraph in particular at a school where only 16 students, the last 19 graduating classes have earned straight A's. And then, boom, awards as top Algebra 2 student, boom, awards as top pre-cal, boom, junior grade superlative. And then I simply cannot recall a junior having won the Varn Award, which almost always belongs to a senior. And then if you're scrolling further down in the letter, 4 consecutive state championships. And this is a one-page letter. And so I think when we talk about the future of letters, where they're going in the next 5 years or so, I think they are going to be getting a little bit shorter and more to the point. I think we as counselors, whether we're at a large public high school like Kim, who sounds like she's doing an amazing job, or whether we're at smaller private high schools, I think we're going to have to be more focused on those anecdotes and comparisons to really communicate quickly. And I think, with the committee-based evaluation system that Yvonne Romero da Silva really got started at the University of Pennsylvania, and which has since spread out. There was a very well-attended session at NACAC last month on committee-based evaluation. I think we as college counselors need to be prepared that that's the way things are going. And so you've got one reader in that system who's reading the academic side. You've got another reader in that system who's reading the personal side, and they're sitting there comparing and talking as they go through an evaluation. And what we were told at that session was that they were spending about 6 minutes per file. Now, keep in mind, that's 2 people spending 6 minutes for a total of 12, but it is a very condensed reading process. And we as counselors are going to have to adapt a little bit what we do to that reading process and hit, I think, more of the highlights. Whether we go to full bore bullet points and anecdotes and so forth, that'll probably be a decision that offices make independently at each different school. But I think what we should all start counting upon and aiming towards is condensing things and making sure those high points are very easy for a reader to see.
Well, Steve, I have to really thank you for sharing all of these examples. It's very interesting to be able to visualize like different kinds of students and what these letters may look like. If we can bring Kim and Tyler back as well for the Q&A portion, I'm going to give this question to you first, Steve, because I think it applies directly to what you were talking about. In the most recent example, you showed us how you integrated some teacher comments into that letter. How do you balance integrating teacher comments without stealing the thunder of the teacher recommendation itself?
I think obviously we have to be really careful that we're not quoting the same teachers, that, hopefully we know what teachers the student is calling upon. And I think we need to be aware as best we can that whatever we're putting in there, because I talk with admissions officers who say, I really don't want the teacher comments from you. I want them from the teachers themselves. Mm-hmm. But there are times in certain kids where I think we're fleshing out a larger, broader picture that is helpful maybe to complement or to support and show that this isn't just one isolated teacher saying this is, a number of teachers. Or they're adding a different, I'll continue the painting metaphor, they're adding a different hue to the letter than perhaps the math teacher might be, or something along those lines.
Okay. This sounds like it's just one of those tight ropes that we have to walk, to make sure that they stay balanced.
I think that's fair.
So this is a general question for the panel for anyone who'd like to answer from one of our viewers. So in the age of the evolution of the way that students are applying to college, so their own app, a paper app, the common application, the coalition application, the universal application, how are you managing the way that you send your counselor letter through portals, through send.edu, Parchment, Naviance, things like that? What does the nuts and bolts, unsexy part of managing the application recommendations look like for you?
Can I address some symbolism here first?
Sure.
Without stepping, I don't want to create a hornet's nest here, but I might. One of the challenges for me with the coalition application has been symbolically a transcript is always a student's transcript. They really own, quote unquote, the transcript. They do not own my letter for them. They do not own the teacher's letters for them. So I have real challenges putting those things in the virtual locker. The transcript's fine, but the letters, because there's symbolically that suggests the student owns it. So what we have done here at Bolles is we've just said, you know what, we'll send you your transcript. It's there if you want to submit it that way. But any letters of recommendation that are required, we will send separately, either via Naviance or directly to an admissions officer via email or something like that. So maybe opening up a bit of a hornet's nest right there, but that is a nuts and bolts thing where we had a philosophical discussion internally before deciding how to handle things at the nuts and bolts level.
I think I think a little bit that goes back, Steve, also to the trust piece that we've talked about.
Absolutely.
A letter carries a lot more weight when someone on the other side reading it can really trust that it hasn't been seen by a student and that it was written without that in mind. And I think we're in the same boat as you all are, where we're not putting letters directly into the locker. And the way that we've explained that to students and families is just that there's a sanctity that exists between the high school and the college and the things that are shared between us, that it better helps our students when a letter is trusted to be written just for those eyes and not thinking that a student might see it.
And I would probably add probably the same thing, because it is a letter that is written by a counselor. And certainly if I were writing a letter for a student, I would want to make sure that that letter was written with integrity and fidelity. So certainly if you ask me to write a letter of recommendation, it's going to be a letter that is a descriptor of such. If I'm uncomfortable writing a letter for you for whatever reason, then I think that as a professional school counselor, it is my obligation to let you know why. I may have reasons in a very candid but appropriate format as to why I feel I should not write that letter for you. So if I'm writing a letter for you, it's going to be done with integrity and fidelity anyway. So those contents should be, again, between the person who wrote the letter and who's going to actually receive that letter.
You know, and I think Tyler and Kim, trust, integrity, fidelity, those are the three key words in what we do and almost everything we do, right, as professional counselors. I do want to be clear, you know, I understand that kids can't see those letters when they go into the coalition, but symbolically, what does it mean for them to have it in their locker? And I think that's what all three of us are really touching upon. So, agreed.
And a quick follow-up question to that, unrelated to the coalition piece, how do you track that you've submitted all necessary items for a student with so many means of submission? What does that look like for you?
I'll start. So for us, we try and handle most of that through eDocs with Naviance if we can. And so most of that we're then able to see, and we're directing students when they have the choice between sending something through their high school or, for example, listing things in the Common App or in other places, to always defer to us because we are able to then track that. For us, that reality is pretty quick, where a student can come in and say, hey, it says that they don't have my transcript or whatever, and we can easily then pull that up and say, well, here's the tracking number, it was sent on this date. And so for us, by far the easiest way to track all of that is through Naviance. And then for the students that are applying to some of the schools that still want things in hard copy, or we're not able to get things electronically, you have to do a little bit more sort of hand accounting of that. Something that we still struggle with a little bit is less what's gone where, but things that go and then finding out that a student hasn't applied. So a student who tells us they're going to be applying someplace, we go through all the process, and then later a college comes back to us and says, hey, we've got, a transcript, but nothing else from so-and-so. But that's fine. I'm happy to have that problem where there's something there from us and nothing from the student, as opposed to the flip.
So specifically with the Naviance piece that you all have mentioned, if you are using Naviance to send a counselor letter for a coalition school this year, are you choosing to do that, or are you going a different route? So I guess said a different way, if you're using Naviance, will you send letters of recommendation for coalition schools via Naviance, or will you go the individual email route?
So we're still planning to send through Naviance, and we're going to sort of see how that goes. Talking to a handful of folks, and for us, the University of Georgia is a huge draw. And so being on the Coalition app this year has changed some things for us. It sounds like most places are trying to stay away from the duplicating of, which in my mind, sort of the first thing I go to is like, oh, well, if we can upload to the email that we've gotten from the student and we can also send electronically, now we've been sort of doubly sure that it's there. But it sounds more and more like places don't want things coming in duplicate. And so when we can defer to Naviance and the eDocs, we're doing that.
So Kim, this is a question for you.
Okay.
So we have a viewer who works for Florida Virtual Schools, and due to the environment, doesn't get to meet face-to-face with students, but you can get a good sense of somebody through phone calls or emails or things like that. What advice might you have for them for how to approach a letter where you maybe don't have that 4-year relationship with the student?
I would probably say that even if they have not physically come into contact with the person, they may want to try some mechanisms, like, for example, if they have a senior parent meeting, or go over what is required for graduation with that student, then maybe that may be a time to provide an opportunity to talk about what expectations they do, and maybe through Skype or some other type of electronic method. And again, because you are seeing those students virtually, then you certainly may want to consider something like a brag sheet or a resume, or creating a database system for those students so that you can have that to reference if you currently need it or for the near future.
That's a great advice. And I would also imagine that with an online school, you can speak so thoroughly to a student's time management, self-advocacy, and those kinds of pieces that may even be more unique than in a traditional setting.
And adding the emphasis that their learning is basically going to be self-directed because it is online. So that would be a good piece to add as well.
And Kim, will you be able to provide a copy of your brag sheet sort of questionnaire that we can post for our viewers?
Yes, I will.
Great. So, all right, this is a tough one. I don't know which one of you wants to jump into this. But what do you do when you have a student who has an academic violation or has been suspended? Essentially, you have to check yes to one of those boxes. How do you handle that in the recommendation? What does that look like for you?
That's a tough situation, especially coming from a public school system, because we're certainly, obligated or committed by guidelines, not only for our school district, but also for our state. And so there could be some liability involved in that. And certainly if a school is asking a question about discipline, then we have the right to respond to that answer. But if they are asking for specific detail, then that is something we do where we pick up the phone and call the admissions counselor and ask them directly what it is that they would like to know, because of the fact that we may be, in essence, violating some rights regarding FERPA, which is, Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act. And so we want to make sure that the school counselor is not held liable for that. So if it's on a case-by-case basis, that's one of those topics where we usually consult with our school district's attorney.
Okay. Tyler, Steve, would you add anything?
I usually do it via an addendum to my letter. I don't make it typically part of the body of the letter. I'll usually write an addendum. Here's what happened at the foot of the letter below my signature line, and then I can refer back to that. And I think that usually communicates that, this is hopefully an isolated incident. If it's not an isolated incident, that's another matter altogether. But that's the way I typically handle it.
Okay. Yeah, we're similar. And so I think like most, at least like most private schools, we sort of have a policy that's set here, and we provide that to students and families. Our policy is that when a college asks, we report that. And so the vast majority of places ask. Anywhere in the Common App, obviously, it's being reported, and we're expecting that students report too. We end up using a very similar model to Steve. I think what I'll add to what Steve said is that for us, it's, I think, important to make sure that you're on the same page with the student about them providing something as well. Again, when you get into places of there being a lack of consistency between the story that's told by a student or a story that's not told at all and not reported by a student, but that a counselor has added that calls into question the integrity of that application.
Absolutely. And this is our last question for the webinar. One of our viewers says that they have kind of always believed that the counselor recommendation isn't a place to reiterate activities or items that you see in a transcript, but some of the examples that we saw on the webinar today did integrate talking about a student's activities. So as you're balancing the brag sheet with writing the counselor letter, with looking at the overall context of a student, how do you sort of determine when it's appropriate to talk about their extracurriculars and when it's better to not include them?
I typically, when I do it, I'm trying to maybe highlight the ones that I think are the most important in the community or in the student's life from my perspective. There's also sort of a verification. You know, a kid can put something on the application, and then it's sort of up to us to say, well, you know, actually, yeah, that team really is that good. Or, you know, this is a real mover and shaker. A lot of the times we are trying to provide context and say, here's what this activity means, or here's where this student stands in the context of our school based on her or his contribution to it over time. So you do want to find that balance point, Aaron. But it would be difficult for me to just completely leave that piece out of it, because we are trying to write the broad overview about that student, and it's a fundamental part of the student's life. You don't want to have a list. Your job's not just to list things, but it is to provide context.
Mm-hmm. And I would echo those sentiments, because we certainly want to make sure that if the student is academically sound or a very good student academically, we want to make sure that we have some type of balance with a student, especially if a student is involved in any type of extracurricular activities or community service-oriented activities, because most of the colleges and universities, even the more selective ones in this day and age, are looking for a more well-rounded student. So I agree that should, in some form or fashion, be emphasized and highlighted.
And just to add, I agree with all of that. I would add that you're thinking about sort of the behaviors within the activities or the academics. And so it's less about what they've done and why they've done it or how they've done it. And so, you know, if it's an athlete that has captained 3 sports, why is it that they've been elected to those positions by their peers? What is it that stands out about their leadership? If it's a student who chose to double up on foreign language as a junior and a senior, what is it that drives that passion and that interest? It's the why and the motives behind what they're doing, I think, more so than just stating what they are doing.
We did get one last question in, and I think it's important that we answer it because it's one of those tough questions. So I'm going to throw it out at you. So I apologize. We're just going to keep going. If you have a student that you feel uncomfortable writing for, or that you feel like you can't support, have you ever been in that situation? How did you tell them no? And then how did you help them find someone to support them? And then the flip side of that is, if you feel like you can't say no and you write, what does that conversation look like with the student?
It's been a long, long time where I've had a student I absolutely felt I couldn't write for. It's been so long, I actually literally used a sticky note on the old paper form and said, call me. And I would probably do something along those lines now. Just I would do it, you know, through uploading and the boxes that you check on Common App and so forth. Where I said, you know, need to talk about this one.
And when you say call me, you're talking to the college. You want the
I'm talking to the college.
Yes. Great.
I think there's a lot that can be read into what's not included in a letter. And so if a letter is particularly brief or gets at the idea that this is a really challenging sort of student for you to support, then I think in some cases that's as good as checking that box saying call me, that especially if it's out of the norm for your school or for your writing, a school reading that would sometimes look at the rec that's been provided and say, okay, well, this is especially vague, or, you know, for a student that you're obligated to write for, if it's just really reserved, that would usually on the college side be a good opportunity to call and have a conversation about that kid.
And I would agree with that too, making sure that you have that additional support in contacting and calling about that kid. But at the same time, I'm like Steve, I can't even remember ever refusing for any reason to write a letter of recommendation for a student. I just feel that in some form or fashion, every student has some type of strength. And so it's my responsibility to take a little bit of time, and it may require a little more time than the other students to find that strength for that, to help support and advocate for that student.
Well, I would feel great having any of the three of you write my letter of recommendation. So thank you so much for your time today, and for our tremendous SACAC community who has tuned in for this webinar. We really appreciate you giving up this hour on a Wednesday when you could have written a letter maybe in this time. I don't know. But to let you know, if you didn't have a question that was answered, when the webinar ends, there'll be a slide that comes up with the contact information for our panelists. And they are such a wealth of knowledge. So if you didn't get a question answered and you want to reach out to one of them, please do. But we will also, under the professional development section of the SACAC website, post a copy of this recorded webinar, as well as copies of letters, Kim's brag sheet, and other resources that we think would be beneficial for you in your writing process. So Tyler, Kim, Steve, thank you so much for your time today. Dave, thank you for running the everything technological behind the scenes. We really appreciate you, and we hope you guys have a great rest of your Wednesday. Take care.
All right. Thank you,
everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.